Okay, any questions about Professor Murray's comments? I've written a few things up on the board that you should have gotten out of his discussion. He, of course, starts with a general discussion of the one-party politics of Texas, both historically and the current, the historical Democratic dominance one-party system versus the current Republican Party dominant one-party system. The major distinction that he makes there is that in the current system with Republican dominance, it is overwhelmingly white, and those who participate among the white voters tend to be conservative to very conservative. Okay, so in his mind, that's an important distinction to make when comparing the current one-party Republican dominant system versus the historic one-party Democratic system. Then he moves to a discussion of the demographic trends, okay? The general population. What's the major takeaway from that? What does he say the major demographic trends are in the general population? Talks about two lines crossing in the very near future. Okay? Exactly, right? What we were seeing from one census to another at the time that he gave this talk in 2010 was about a 5 to 6 percentage point increase in the percentage of the Hispanic population in Texas. Okay, now that continued to increase in the most recent census, the 2020 census. And again, he points out the decline in the Anglo population as a percentage of the overall population in Texas. So I'm not sure if we've reached the point that he's talking about where those two lines cross, but if not, we're very, very close. I mean, that's not hard to check. We could check that. And maybe if I can remember to do that, I'll do that before we come, before I have my Thursday class meeting. Okay. At any rate, yeah, that's the general population. But of course, more important, more relevant to his discussion is the trend in the voting population, right? So what does he say about the trend in the Latino segment of the voting population? What's going on there? He says something about registered voters, right? As a percentage of registered voters, that's increasing, right? So at the time that he gave this talk in 2010, I think the number he gave was about 21% of registered voters in Texas are Hispanic, but the turnout among Hispanics is much lower, right? And he says there's a big difference if, between 12 to 13% of the total voter turnout being Hispanic in Texas versus 15 or 16% being Hispanic. That it makes a huge difference in the outcome of an election, right? So, he talks for a little bit about how Democrats need to, if they're going to become competitive anyway, that they need to mobilize the Hispanic vote in Texas. Then he gets into his discussion about the top-down strategy. And there's, I think, a point here where we can kind of check out some of his predictions, how they actually panned out, right? Because one of the things that he says, giving this talk in 2010, is that the 2010 governor's race ought to be competitive. He doesn't predict that Bill White's going to win, but he says that Bill White should be competitive. So I should have called this up ahead of time. Bear with me here for just a second. Let me do this before I forget. Okay, so we're going to just check out some election results here real quick. If I can find the right link, I think this is it. (2010) general election statewide, and we're going to have to scroll down past all these congressional races, and we get to the Texas governor's race. In that year, you can see that it really wasn't competitive. Rick Perry, the Republican incumbent, about 55% of the vote. Bill White only got about 42% of the vote. That's, by the way, not a close election. That's 12 percentage points, 13 percentage points is really a huge victory. Okay, so it didn't pan out in 2010 to be a competitive election. But then he also says that the Democrats may even have a chance of winning the Texas governor's race by 2014. So let's see what happened in 2014. I actually do have these results. You can see that in 2014, when Greg Abbott first ran for the governor's office, he beat Democrat Wendy Davis by an even bigger margin. It's not getting better for the Democrats, it's getting worse for the Democrats, right? Because here you can see Greg Abbott won almost 60% of the vote, which is huge. Okay. And then 4 years later in 2018, it wasn't as big of a victory, but it still was a very comfortable victory for Greg Abbott, really similar to what Rick Perry had beaten Bill White by in 2010, right? So we're back to that 55-42 split. So we'll see what happens in 2020. You know, in 2022, the governor's election is unfolding currently. In fact, today, I'm sure you're aware, is the last day to vote. Though it's actually primary day. And so if you haven't voted yet, if you're registered to vote, you still have a chance to go do that. But as we've said now once or twice in a previous class meeting, it looks like fairly safe to say that Greg Abbott is going to be renominated by the Republican Party, and Beto O'Rourke will probably be the Democratic candidate. Now, some of you may remember that Beto O'Rourke ran a U.S. Senate campaign, and Professor Murray doesn't talk at all about, you know, how the Democrats might rebuild by, you know, this top-down strategy. He doesn't even mention U.S. Senate races, but you know, I suspect that if we had him here and we could ask him, hey, you know, would that be the kind of race that might help the Democrat? I think he would probably say yes, right? That sure, yeah, if you can win a statewide race, a U.S. Senate race, that may not be as good as the governor's office, but it's still pretty good, right? So you can see when Beto O'Rourke ran against Ted Cruz back in 2018 that, you know, it was a pretty competitive election. Ted Cruz squeaked out the victory, but Beto O'Rourke made it pretty competitive. And so maybe many Democrats here in 2022 are pinning their hopes on Beto O'Rourke doing the same thing with the governor's race. We'll have to see how that plays out. And I'm certainly not one to make predictions. I would be surprised, though, just based on the recent history in Texas politics, whether or not that race in November is a close race. Might be closer than, recent ones, but does Beto O'Rourke have a fighter's chance? We'll see. At any rate, bottom line for our purposes, the point I'm trying to get to is that it doesn't look like any of Professor Murray's prognostications about what might have happened over the previous decade with respect to the top-down strategy have really borne out. In fact, the Democrats don't seem any closer in 2014 and 2018 than they were in 2008, 2006, when that was his reference point. Okay. Questions about that? What about the the state house races? He says the bottom up strategy would be for the Democrats to win seats in the state House of Representatives. In fact, he even says that we will probably see, he says, right there before I shut him off for you, he said, we will probably see that the Democrats have a majority in the state house by 2016 or 2018. Okay? But you can see here that, in fact, that hasn't happened. Here is the results from 2011, 2012. This would have been the results of the 2010 election where he was talking. You see the Democrats only had 32%, less than a third of the seats in the state House of Representatives, 2/3 majority for the Republicans. 2 years later, that goes up a little bit, not by very much though, still just a little over a third of the seats in the House of Representatives are held by Democrats. In the 84th legislature, it goes back down a little bit. So that in the state House, you're still right around a third. The Democrats are still right around a third. Now, where we do see a change beginning is it bumps back up a little bit here in 2017, 2018. But where we really begin to see the change is with the 2018 election. okay, where, I don't know if you all can remember this, it's been now 4 years ago, but when the national media people were talking about the blue wave, because that was the year that the Democrats regained control of the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, and so many Democrats were elected national, to the House of Representatives nationally, particularly women. That was a year where a lot of women were elected to the House of Representatives, and you can see some of that maybe bled over into Texas. You see that the percentage here increases fairly dramatically, but it's still 10 full 10 percentage points deficit that the Democrats have in the House, and an even bigger deficit still in the Texas Senate. Right. So the most recent election in 2020, the Democrats were pinning a lot of hopes on that, but you can see that they're still got about a 10 percentage point deficit. A 10 percentage point deficit that I think that Democrats, if we would ask Democratic leaders in Texas if they were happy with the results in 2020, I think that if they're honest, they would say, no, it was really disappointing, because they had, I think consistent with Professor Murray's observations, pinned a lot of hopes on winning a majority in the state house, but didn't really come close. And maybe that's a testament more than anything else to the skill with which Republicans have drawn district lines and so on, making it very difficult for Democrats to get some very safe Republican districts. Okay. Anyway, we'll see what happens in 2022. But those are the kind of things that I think Professor Murray would tell us to look at is, are the Democrats at the state house, or is their percentage of seats in the state house increasing? Well, last couple elections, yeah, it has increased a little bit, but whether that's sustained in 2022, as I said, is something we'll have to see if that plays out. Okay, questions, comments? Well, we're just about out of time, so we'll call it a class meeting at that, and we'll see you on next Tuesday.